Book 101 review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. She's the author of debut book, author of Miss Linda Shirey, Wolves Among Us. No other than Miss Sherry, of course. Linda Rayburn Sherry.
Yes, I am. I am
Welcome
glad to be here with you today.
Welcome to Book 101, Miss Linda. And can you please introduce more about yourself?
Yeah, just a little background. I have been a church member essentially since I was born, kind of born into a church going family. And we moved from San Diego to Phoenix because of some church trouble. And that's Phoenix in Arizona. It's a very large city. Um, and I gained an interest in legal things. So I became a legal receptionist and a legal secretary. And then I dabbled around in a few things in my 20s, as you do. And then came back around to the realization that the legal field was really where I wanted to focus and became a paralegal. So after I had obtained certification, and in 2019, my husband and I and my mother decided that we really needed to move church locations. So while everyone has a COVID 2020 experience, mine was doing a major surgery, recovering from it, and writing Wolves Among Us. It was a long term topic in the making. So I have some background in legal things, and that kind of flavors the approach that I take to writing about predators in churches. Because I'm especially outlining processes and procedures that people can use, one, so that they don't feel like they're dealing with mental health issues and identifying problems in their church, and two, they maybe know a little bit more about what to do with it, what they're allowed to do. So one of the jobs that I held was at the State Bar of Arizona, and that regulates attorneys. And you get a very eye-opening look into what attorneys do when they go bad, and some of the processes that they are put through when people discover that they really need to have their license taken away. It was a fascinating job, and in some ways I still miss it. But that kind of led me, working in the State Bar of Arizona, actually led me to thinking about writing this book. So yeah, it was a thought process for a while that took a while to distill and write down. But that's what I did during COVID, was write.
Miss Linda Shirey, thank you so much for sharing your empowering book to the world. So, what does the Bible say about spiritual predators?
One, it says that you can identify them. So in the introduction, I'm essentially saying Jesus says, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits." And I take that fairly literally. You will recognize them. You will see the trend of their character by what they do. So when Jesus is saying things about predators that he experienced, such as the Pharisees and Sadducees that had gotten off track of biblical things, they they showed their fruits, not really by what they said, quite often by what they left out, but mostly by what they did. So there's a big disconnect in predators between what they will tell you they're all about and who they really are. And I think the Bible is chock full of examples of people who will say one thing and do another, and that's a major thing to pay attention to.
Interesting, Miss Linda. So, how can we define a wolf among us in a spiritual context?
It's a very good question. they make it very difficult. There is a bit that I flagged about how faithful people get confused by wolves because their character is so very alien from what it should be and from what you expect it to be. They make it difficult to identify themselves. But in a spiritual context, you can usually tell them by an overwhelming emphasis on things having to do with self focus and pride. Everything shining the spotlight on themselves, either them as a victim or them as a conqueror. It's not so much about service or about giving of yourself or about, say, taking up your cross and carrying it. The emphasis would be more on how everything looks as opposed to how everything is. So I go into a great deal of detail. Some of my reviewers have said things about how helpful it is to have, say, the list that I give of this is the characteristic of a wolf versus this is a characteristic of, say, a strong minded sheep. And there's a chart in which I go into detail, like they will do this versus a sheep doing that, because it is important to separate out what are the characteristics of somebody who's intentional in using others for their own gain as opposed to sort of unintentionally harming. That would be the characteristic of maybe a strong minded sheep.
Very well said, Miss Linda. Beautifully articulated. And what are the key characteristics of a spiritual predator?
Getting back to the using people for their own gain. So this will come out in financial areas. This will come out in emotional areas. Usually, there will be issues with their relationships with other people, person to person, if they're married and their marital conflicts. They will very often be rather assertive. Whether or not their personality is assertive, they might have, say, a soft voice and a really winning attitude. But you will tend to find that their spouses are not built up. They don't grow stronger over time. They grow weaker, as though the wolf is feeding on them, which they very much are. Um, and they will also, in any group that they are a part of, there's a high content of conflict that doesn't get resolved until you start wondering, is this intentional to never have it resolved? Um, and wherever they go, they tend to engage in division, argument, without any resolution. I have started to look for any particular churches that have, say, a high content of inflammatory diseases, the long term diseases that just don't get solved, that don't seem to have any origin, and also mental health issues. It seems to follow wolves wherever they go. Sometimes they create it in order to pretend to solve it. Sometimes it just happens because, like I said, they will say one thing and they will do another.
Certainly. So, what the biblical examples illustrate the presence of a spiritual predators?
One of the best examples would be I cull mainly from the Old Testament. There are some in the New Testament, but if I can say my favorite, two of my favorites are Hophni and Phineas, who were Old Testament priests. And what they would do was instead of following the protocols laid down in the Bible for sacrifices, and sacrifices were meant to bring people closer together with God, they would one they would use and abuse the women at the prayer meetings. It said that they would lie with them. You can understand what that means. And two, that they would also use their own servants to go to the people putting together a sacrifice and tell them while such and such piece of meat is boiling, cooking, we're going to take the best part of it for ourselves. And that was clearly against the rules that God had laid out for what they were supposed to do. The consequence for that was very severe. The entire family was wiped out, essentially. And there was a prophecy about how the entire line was going to be wiped out because the father of these two very wicked priests, it was fama clamosa. That's a phrase for a very well-known, well-publicized issue. He had a sit down meeting with his sons and essentially told them this is not what you're supposed to do, but he didn't follow it up with any consequences. They were clearly not favored by God for destroying his worship service. And another example is a prophet gone haywire called Balaam, and he would invoke God's name and he would do things to try to gain favor with various high level political figures who had come to him, kings, essentially. So there's this very long instance in the Old Testament where Balaam gets together with Balak, the king, who has asked for his help in cursing the Israelite people. And Balaam tries multiple ways to get this done because he's going to gain by it financially. He's going to gain a bunch of fame and acclaim and a great deal of money, and he cannot pull it off because while he is riding a donkey with these princes to go and meet up with Balak and curse the Israelite people, God sends an angel with a sword to essentially tell his donkey he goes past this point and he dies. So the what Balaam had to realize through the mouth of his talking donkey was that his plan was not going to succeed. But he essentially had to be threatened with death to not curse the Israelite people. He tried it multiple different ways. And then he hid behind God as an excuse and said, well, God won't let me curse the people, when Balak found out that he was going up to the mountaintops, and instead of cursing the people of Israel, he was blessing them. So one of the things that Balak used was he used God as a shield to get done what he wanted. So it is made very clear, especially in the New Testament, that he was a false prophet.
So, Miss Linda, let's talk about identifying spiritual deception.
Hmm.
How can Christians discern between true and false teachers?
One of the primaries is whether or not they're introducing something new, because Christianity has been around ever since Judaism has been around. It is simply the outworking of Judaism with Christ as the Messiah. So, for thousands of years, the teaching has been the same. God has not changed his characteristics. So, usually, they will be offering something new as a way of bringing life to their particular outworking of spirituality, of religion. And maybe another characteristic is that they will, beyond the novelty of it, they will try to take something that is established that most people know very little about, reframe it, and re-identify it, redefine it, if you will. So in the same way that you can take an older institution that has maybe struggled and fallen on hard times, you can use their name and then you can do things that's completely apart from the original purpose of it. You can see that in educational institutions. You can see it in old established churches. People will come in and they will say, we need a fresh face. We need new life in this congregation. And by simple force of personality, they will inject things into the group that they are supposedly serving, and redefine things in a way that suits them and suits their agenda. Um, and usually the church or the congregation will pick up speed, pick up energy, pick up followers, and then the underlying issues will come out over time, unfortunately. So, one of the things that false prophets very often do is they will say, well, people need more direction, they need more guidance. And these are all the ways in which we will give them direction and guidance. And it almost inevitably means all of the emphasis goes in a particular group of directions that is geared toward short term results and not long term growth. It has nothing to do with discipling people in what Jesus actually taught. It has nothing to do with teaching and training and mentoring them in patient, slow, organic ways. It's really the emphasis is on speed, influence, power, and authority. So you'll have a heavy, heavy emphasis, for example, on, say, male headship, very heavy, very driven, or you'll have a special emphasis on sin and brokenness and the awfulness of sin, and not really anything about resolution of how people can come to the cross, can come to Jesus broken as they are, and get restored and redeemed. So it's not about resolution, it's about helping people feel badly and then offering themselves, not really Jesus or his word as a solution, if that makes sense.
Makes sense, Miss Linda. So, what would be your advice for those people out there seeking for true religion?
True religion and undefiled is this, that you visit widows and orphans in their affliction and you keep yourself unspotted from the world. I think that's from James. So it's not specifically that you go out and do good works, but that your good works flow from the gratitude that you have from being saved from your sin. I'm not saying that you de emphasize sin. I'm saying that if you don't want to support false teachers, you won't fall under the spell of, well, good works will cover those sins. No, Jesus' blood covered those sins. You look to him, you believe his word as he says it, you take up your cross and you follow him in exactly the path that he followed, as best you're able in the 21st century. Not saying
Certainly.
that you have to go back to walking everywhere and wearing a sewn from the top tunic. No, none of those outward appearances, but from a heartfelt experience. You should be able to do in general the kinds of things that he did, not specifically raise people from the dead, that was his purview, but you should be able to visit widows and orphans in their affliction. You should be able to engage in church life on a regular, consistent basis, whether people like you there or not. Those are the sorts of things that he did. So he gave
Certainly.
us that model and that example.
Thank you so much for your advice, Miss Linda. So, what would be your short term and long term goals in writing?
Um, Long term, I would love to be able to finish my three-part series. I'm working on Cults Among Us. That's when wolves band together and create their own group. Um, so there's Cults Among Us, and then hopefully the third book will be a compilation of wisdom gleaned from others who have more than my experience, and they can tell me their experiences with wolves and with cults and with churches gone wonky. And without naming any names, of course, I'm hoping to be able to distill that into further wisdom about what to do about things facing churches today, as far as predators and as far as bullies in the pews. But hopefully, book four, I already have it three quarters written with a friend, and it's a fictional book about a man who lives in a small town and just small town life. It's kind of inspired by all the 1930s, 1940s British literature that I was really addicted to in my 20s and 30s. So this small town life has its own rhythm and its own patterns, and this man, Sir Nigel, is very much he's an iconoclast. He wants to be a hermit, but he can't. And so part of the book is the realization that he comes to that something he'd been holding on to for years, he really needs to let go. You know, kind of an emotional hoarder is what he is. So I have a good deal of experience clearing out hoarders' nests. That was part of the state bar work that I did. You wouldn't believe what people hold on to: the files, the piles, the videos. Just amazing. But yeah, long term, I'd love to be able to shift more into kind of small town fiction, and make a go of it just as a writer. I think that's where I'm trending.
Good luck to your goals, Miss
Thank you.
Linda, and hoping for more and more empowering books like this to come. So, before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, Food 101, in its fifth season, People Fifth Season, with Chef Alessandro, one of the specialty chef in one of the five-star hotel in downtown Toronto. Please do listen to our latest episode. We are reading our letter senders all over the world. So please do listen Food 101 wherever you listen your podcast. So Miss Linda, what long-term effects do spiritual predators have on individuals and church communities?
They leave a trail of destruction that is very disappointing, very preventable, and very visible. So in their wake, there are usually church splits, there are usually family splits, and sometimes they can be driven off. Sometimes they can be corralled, they can be shamed into slinking off and becoming ineffective. But yeah, most of the time, you will see that the growth around them is not long term. So it would be, you know, grass that withers rather than, say, oak trees that start small and grow bigger over time. Essentially, everything that they do really could be thrown into the fire. Yeah, just a lot of brokenness. And I'm not sure how to turn that into something positive other than to say when they are driven out, people are happier, they are more satisfied with life, and yeah, life looks a lot less grim when they are not around.
Miss Linda Shirey, thank you so much again for sharing your talents to the world. And as I said, we are looking forward for more and more and more empowering books like this. So can you please invite our listeners to support Wolves Among Us?
Thanks, Daniel. Appreciate it.
You must welcome. So where are they gonna buy your Wolves Among Us?
Primarily on Amazon. It's also on Ingram Spark, but yeah, most of the activities on Amazon for now. I'll be working on an audiobook in the fall.
Looking forward for that audiobook, Miss Linda. So people, let's support Miss Linda Shari because if you support her, as I said, more and more and more empowering books or biblical books to come. So Miss Linda, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Daniel. You take care.
More to come, people. See you soon.